Hello everybody, and welcome to the 15th video of the TypeScript Game Engine tutorial series. Today we're going to talk about how we're going to add this type of functionality, such as rotating objects and whatnot, to game objects in our engine. And what this really is it's a behavior, and some of the other game engines that are out there, such as Unity, use this term, and I can't really think of a better way to describe what it is, so I'm actually going to stick with behavior for this as well. So what a behavior is it defines some type of action or change that is applied to the object to which it's attached. So in other words, in this case, we can see that we are actually rotating the parent object, and we're rotating the child object during the update loop. So this really would be two separate behaviors that are applied. One would be applied to the parent object, one would be applied to the child object, and both of those should be invoked on the update loop. So the next thing we need to figure out is how we actually go about representing that in our zone file, in our zone data. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to represent this in a very similar fashion to how components are actually represented. So I'm actually going to create a new object here called behaviors, and it's going to be an array, and just like before, it's going to hold an array of objects basically, and it's going to have, each behavior is obviously going to have a name, and in this case we're going to just call it rotate X. It can be called whatever. It's going to have a type, which is going to be rotation, and it's also going to have a rotation property, which is going to define the vector 3 of our rotation. So in our case, it's going to have a rotation on the z-axis, because that's what we want for this particular instance. So we're going to configure that to rotate 0.01. And so this is basically going to translate into this code that we see here. So we need a way to load up these behaviors. So all behaviors are going to have a name. They're going to have builders just like the components, so we'll need a builder that defines a type, and then the behavior data, which will define things such as name and rotation amount. Now, I also want to take this opportunity to mention that we should really include two types of behaviors here. There should be one type of behavior that happens on update, and there should be another type of behavior that is triggered by some sort of event. And so I'm going to call those behaviors in general, but behaviors could be applied in one of those two ways. And so when we create our interfaces for that, we're going to keep both of those things in mind when we actually create our behavior. So the first thing we're going to need to do in core, we're going to add a new folder. First thing I need to do is actually stop running the application. Okay, new folder. We're going to call that behaviors. Okay, and we're going to create some interfaces. So we'll create a new TypeScript file, and we'll call this I behavior namespace TSE export interface iBehavior behavior. There we go. And in this case, it's just going to declare a name, and that's it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new TypeScript file, and we're going to call this iBehavior builder. And I'm actually just going to copy this, paste it here, change that to iBehavior builder, change this to type string, and that's actually going to be read only. And I'm actually going to go to iComponent Builder and just copy this build from JSON, except that's going to return a iBehavior. Okay, so there's our iBehavior builder. And I'm going to go ahead and add another TypeScript file, and this is going to be called iBehavior data. And I'm actually going to copy iComponent data and just rename it. Because it does, at this point, basically the same thing. Now, one could argue that a behavior could be considered the same thing as a component, but a component shouldn't really define how it behaves. It should define what it is, whereas a behavior defines what can be done to it. And it keeps things decoupled in such a way where you can apply multiple behaviors to the same type of component, and so you have a lot more flexibility in what each of these things can do versus trying to roll all that logic into an actual component. So we have our iBehavior builder, and our iBehavior data. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need is we're going to need to add our rotation behavior. So I'm going to add a new TypeScript file, and I'm going to call this rotation behavior, namespace TSE. Okay, and I'm going to export class called rotation behavior, and it's going to implement iBehavior. Okay, and that of course is going to have some required properties, which in this case is just going to be the name. Change that to public. It's also going to let's go ahead and switch this up a bit. Actually, let's go ahead and create another TypeScript file, and we're going to call that base behavior. I'm actually just going to copy all this over here, and I'm going to rename this to base. And change this to an abstract class. And it's going to have the name, and it's also going to provide a protected data, which is going to be an iBehavior data. Okay? And it's going to provide a public constructor that's going to take in data iBehavior data. Okay, and it's going to say this dot data equals data, this dot name equals this dot data dot name. Okay, so it just does that basic stuff for us out the box. And then now I can just say, instead of implements iBehavior, I can just say extends base behavior. And now I don't need to worry about that. So next, this is going to have a public constructor. Actually, before I can fill that out, I need to create the data class for it. So I'm going to say export class rotation behavior data. And this is going to implement iBehavior data. Okay. So this is going to have a couple of, it's going to have a public name and a public set from JSON. And this is also going to provide a public rotation, and it's going to be a vector 3. And we're actually going to set that to vector 3.0. by default. And what we want to do in this is we want to say if this.name equals undefined, we want to throw a new error. Name must be defined in behavior data. Okay. Otherwise, we're just going to say this.name equals, whoops, this should be JSON.name, not this.name. String JSON.name. Okay. And then I'm going to say if this dot, whoops, again, if JSON dot rotation is not equal to undefined, I'm going to say this dot rotation set from JSON, JSON dot rotation. And that should be everything we need to do for the behavior data. So we're actually going to need the data for our constructor here. So we're going to say data, rotation behavior data. And then here we're going to call super and pass data. Okay. And here we're going to create a private rotation. And it's going to be vector 3. And we want to say this dot rotation equals data dot rotation. Okay. Now, the next thing that we need to set up for behavior, not behavior data, iBehavior, is we need to set up a update, which takes in time, which is a number, turns type void, and it needs to take in a I don't know if I want to call that trigger. Let's call it apply. And this will be when the behavior should be applied to the object to which it's attached. And the other thing I want to do here is I want to pass through some user data, potentially. Most of the time this probably won't contain anything, but I want to have the ability to do that. Probably won't come up anytime soon, but I want to put it that way in the interface because I know I'm going to need it later. So basically anything that calls apply on a specific behavior should be able to pass any sort of data through to it, and the behavior should know how to extract what information it needs from that user data that's passed through. So that's what that's for. Okay. One last thing that I'm going to need is I'm going to need a set owner, and the owner is going to be, for now, a it's going to be a sim object, and that likely is going to change down the road, but for right now behaviors can only be attached to sim objects. Great. So I'm going to copy these things because now I know I'm going to need them in the base behavior. So I'll paste those there, make them all public. Okay. And I'm going to say protected underscore owner sim object. And I'm going to say this dot owner equals owner. Okay. And I'm actually going to leave these two as is. I don't want to set these to abstract because the inheriting behavior may only need one or the other of these, and I don't want to have to force the implementation of that on either. But the the inheritor should override the ones that it needs. Okay, so in rotation behavior, it looks like we're missing some things now. I'm actually going to need to say, what is this? Base behavior used before its declaration. Okay, so I just need to include a reference there. Drag and drop that. Okay. And I'm actually going to copy this update because this is the one I'm going to need for this. So the first thing I want to do, actually the last thing I'm going to do here is call super.update time. Okay, and in this case, I'm going to say, oops. Okay, so this behavior is going to be very simple. This rotation behavior actually requires a method that we need to add to vector3, so I'm just going to add a couple of very simple methods to this, some utility methods here. So the first one is going to be public add. And I'm just going to call this v, which is going to be a vector3. And we'll return a vector3. And so what this is going to do is it's going to add the vector that's passed in to this vector and then return this vector. So we can say return this. Okay? And we're going to say this dot underscore x equals v dot underscore plus equals v underscore x. And so I'm going to do the same for y and z. So y, z, y, z. Okay. And now I'm going to copy that whole method, rename it to subtract, change this to a minus equals, copy it again, change this to multiply, change this to a times equals, and as you probably have guessed, divide. And I'm going to change this to divide equals. Okay. I'm going to close that. We're done with that for now. So in this case, I want to add the rotation. So I want to say this.owner.transform.rotation.add, and I want to say this.rotation. And that's it. That is as simple as this behavior is. It really doesn't do a whole lot. All it does is it takes the rotation value that is passed in here, in this case on the z-axis, and then it adds it. So it adds for x, y, and z. And that is basically how we're going to get our object to rotate. One more thing I need to create is I need to export class rotation behavior builder and implements behavior builder. Okay. And I'm going to control dot and implement that interface. Change this to public, change this to public get. I want to return rotation. So again, this type is going to match the type that we declare here. That's how that's going to know what builder to use for that. And we want to build from JSON, so we want to say let data equal new rotation behavior data. We want to say data set from JSON, JSON, and then we want to return new rotation behavior data. And that's it. That's all the builder actually has to do. Okay? And of course, like we did for our component, we need to have something to register this behavior with. So in behaviors, we are going to add a new TypeScript file, and we're going to call this behavior manager. And namespace TSE, export class behavior manager. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go to the component manager and I'm going to copy all of this because it's 90% the same. Except we're dealing with behaviors instead of components. So we can say I behavior builder, register builder, that's going to be a I behavior builder, and extract component, this is going to be I behavior, this is going to say extract behavior. Change these to behavior manager. Behavior, change that. And we should be good to go. Okay, so let's close that. And in the rotation behavior, we are going to auto-register the builder. So we're going to say behavior manager dot register builder, new rotation behavior builder. And I'm guessing, similar to the component, we're going to need a reference to that as well. Behavior manager, yep. So we add that reference there by dragging and dropping. Okay, so now our builder is created and registered. We have all of our interfaces set up. The next thing that we need to do is actually go to the sim object, and we need to add another method here. So underneath add component, we're going to create a public add behavior. It's going to be called, going to take a behavior of type I behavior, return type void. And before we can actually fill that out, we need private behaviors I behavior array equals empty array. Okay. And we need to say this, that behaviors dot push behavior, and then we can say behavior dot set owner this. Okay. Behaviors don't need to be loaded, so we don't need to worry about that. We do, however, need to include it in our update loop. They don't get rendered, so we don't have to worry about that, but I'm actually just going to copy this for loop for the components. So after we update the components, we're going to update the behaviors. So I'm going to change this to let b of this behaviors be update time. And that way all of our behaviors get updated every frame. Okay, so now that we have that, our zone manager in our, whoops, sorry, not zone manager, zone. So in this, we need to basically have a copy of this component's code. And I'm looking at load sim object here. So I'm going to create a copy of that and say data section dot behaviors. And just copy that over, change this to B to make it more obvious as to what it is. So there's the data. We'll say behavior equals behavior manager dot extract behavior data sim object add behavior behavior. So as you can see, it's almost the same code, but not quite. But it does keep it nice and clean. So we load up our components, and then we load up our behaviors. Okay, so let's just make sure that our test zone is saved. And it is. I believe that is actually everything that we need to do. So what I've done here is I've just added this behavior to the parent. So we should just see the parent rotating and the child rotating along with it, but not rotating on its own. So let's go ahead and run this. Probably going to have to do a hard reload here. Unexpected string, position 712. What did we mess up? Oh, I forgot a comma here. Okay, we just refresh that. And there we are. So that's exactly what we expected it to be when we added that behavior. So we can see that the behavior has been added to the parent game object, but not the child game object. So just to illustrate sort of the power of using these files to set up our zones, I'm going to copy this behaviors and go into the children and this first child here after components and paste a copy of that behaviors array. And so what essentially that should do is it should apply another behavior very similar to that to the child. So the child should be rotating on its own as well. And so I'm going to control F5 to reload that. And now we see that the child is rotating relative to the parent, but also on its own. So that is everything we're going to do for behaviors right now. We have the architecture in place to be able to add our components and our behaviors to game objects, which is going to greatly increase our ability to make things interactive in the engine and make things dynamic. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out this video for now. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned. Please give me some feedback and comments below. And I will see you guys in the next video.